Hi, my name is Brandon, and I'm an alcoholic and addict in recovery. And reading from Fuck Feelings by Michael A. Bennett and Michael I. Bennett and Sarah Bennett. Today, the section I was reading was talking about dealing with behaviors like avoidance and procrastination, dishonesty, behaviors that we typically regard as negative, and behaviors that in the people who display them can actually cause a lot of shame and disappointment in themselves. And they're talking about how to take responsibility, not necessarily for having those behaviors, but for addressing them and for living in spite of your tendency to do them. So I'm going to read a section about this because it fits in nicely with both recovery in general and the next section of the book where they talk about recovery. So they say, while accepting that you have a problem is in fact the universal first step, accepting responsibility for having it is not. Brain wiring can cause well-motivated, smart people to procrastinate and drop the ball, and nature gives them no choice. The fact that you're not responsible for having a problem, however, never relieves you of the responsibility for working with it and finding ways around it, and often requires you to overcome deeply ingrained bad habits and attitudes. It's impossible to change your instincts or make distractedness, impulsiveness, and scattered thinking go away. You can, however, become a good manager of the impulses to procrastinate, avoid, lie, and cover up. I really liked this because I think it's an important distinction for us to keep in mind. Too many of us blame ourselves or blame our situations for the way we act. And we spend a lot of time thinking about who's at fault and why we're in the position that we're in. And really, our emphasis is, and our time is better spent thinking about what am I going to do about it. So, in the case of a behavior that you don't like about yourself, it almost doesn't matter whether it's something that's ingrained in you or whether it's something that happened because of a way that you were treated as a child. What matters is what can you do now to manage it, and setting realistic expectations for yourself about whether or not it's something that is likely to happen again. I know, for example, that I have a tendency to procrastinate on certain types of tasks. Not everything. Things I enjoy doing, I dive right into. But on certain types of tasks, I have a tendency to procrastinate. That tendency to procrastinate is something that is likely not going to go away. So what I have to do is learn how to better manage, learn how to, one, identify the tasks that are likely to fall into that category, and two, figure out how to better manage them. One of the things that's worked for me is to break those tasks up into even smaller tasks. And that's what I find is that sometimes this tendency to procrastinate is tied to tasks that are so large and that will take so much time to complete that it's a little difficult to wrap my head around getting them done when I look at them at a very high level. But if I break them down into smaller, more easily accomplishable tasks, then it's easier for me to jump in and start working on them. So we have to learn to manage these tendencies in ourselves rather than getting upset with ourselves for having them. That's not a very good use of our time. We really need to think about what can we do about these tendencies and how can we learn how to manage them. And as with all of these kinds of issues, once we start to do that, all of a sudden they start coming up in our life less and less and less. So they go on to say, most people avoid this step. So most people avoid figuring out, what do I need to do to manage these issues? Most people avoid this step because it's painful to know that something about you doesn't work right. But doing so will save energy you're wasting on self blame and apology, and will give you ideas about better things to do than kicking yourself. So, for those of us who have these kinds of tendencies to procrastinate, to be dishonest, to avoid difficult tasks, to avoid confrontation, all of these kinds of issues. For those of us with these tendencies, it's often painful to admit that we have them, and painful to think about what do I need to do in order to gain some kind of management of these tendencies. And that's one of the pieces of advice that they give, is that you need to be a little bit less hard on yourself. So don't kick yourself, don't spend time blaming yourself, and don't spend time thinking you're a terrible person just because you have the tendency to avoid dealing with difficult situations, for example. Don't beat yourself up over that. Instead, they point to something that's a key component of 12-step work as well, which is establishing values that you feel are important to live by, working toward those, and then instead of being upset with yourself for these tendencies that you've got toward these other behaviors, be happy with yourself for working toward the values you feel are important. And here's what they say about that. As soon as you accept who you are, think hard about the standards you want to live up to and less about looking normal, pleasing authorities, and competing with others. Use those standards to manage your inner fuck up by redoubling your efforts to learn whatever you really care about and manage bad behavior. Rely on your own standards for defining hard work, reliability, and self reliance, and use your gifts to achieve them in your own way. If your career happens to lack prestige or follows an unconventional, restless path, don't criticize yourself. Respect yourself all the more for having found a way to meet standards using equipment you didn't choose and given habits that are hard to break. As long as you've developed values you believe in and have reason to think that you're doing your best to work at living up to them, you'll always be a success, even if learning you've got a wacky brain is hard to swallow. So it's really important for us to remember as people in recovery that whether or not we're responsible for having an addiction, whether or not we're responsible for what got us to this point, we're responsible for what happens in the future, and we're responsible for trying to manage anything that we've recognized in ourselves as something that's problematic. So my addiction, whether or not it came from, events that happen in my life or faulty brain wiring, that doesn't matter. What matters is my management of it and my taking responsibility for, okay, I know I've got this issue. What am I going to do about it now? And it's the same with other things in life: procrastination, avoidance, dishonesty, anything that's getting in the way of us achieving the things that we think we should be achieving. And we've also got to follow the advice that the authors give here about making sure our thoughts about achieving really line up with the values we feel are important in life. And we've got to make sure that we're not thinking about achievement in life in terms of what other people think is important, but really connecting with ourselves about what values do we find important, and then being objective about our own performance in trying to live up to those values. As long as we're doing the best we can to live up to those values, as long as we're trying to be the people that we want to be, then there's no reason to spend time blaming ourselves for anything, kicking ourselves for mistakes. the best time that we can spend is learning from those mistakes. And that is what helps us grow rather than keeps us in a place where we're just setting ourselves up for further disappointment. That's it for today. Hope you have a good one, and I'll be back here tomorrow with more.